Hi all and welcome to this chess news video. This is not just any video I noticed when I was preparing for this one. It is actually the 100th I'm creating for the Better Your Chess channel. Now that in itself is cause for celebration, and therefore I have decided to give away a 33% discount on the perpetual Better Your Chess University membership. If you want to make use of this offer, then use the link in the video description below. But please note that the offer is valid for 5 days only, so make sure to sign up in time. Okay, now without further ado, let's discuss today's game. And today's game is the game that was played during the first round of the 6th Sinquefield Cup 2018 between Mamedyarov with the white pieces and Wesley So with the black pieces. Okay, as discussed in previous videos, we know that Mamedyarov is on a roll, and he didn't disappoint us in this game either. Okay, so let's see what happened. He opened up with 1d4, and Wesley So defended with knight f6. There followed c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and we have an orthodox queen's gambit. Bishop g5, bishop e7, e3, castles was played, and now we see already a rare move, a little bit of the hallmark of Mamedyarov, right, to play rare moves. Queen c2. Okay, now Wesley reacts in a way that sort of invites white to give up his bishop pair, but maintain the advantage of the first move. He now plays h6, questioning the bishop, and Mamedyarov plays bishop takes f6 and bishop takes f6. But now it was white's turn again to come up with something interesting and keep, let's say, the advantage of the first move. I think that if your opponent plays a rather rare move, then maybe it's, well, not really time to punish him, but at least to try and play a very principled move. I think that h7, h6, although fine in itself and absolutely not losing or something, is maybe not the most principled way of playing. I think that if your opponent moves his queen rather early in the opening, then maybe it is time to start opening up the position with c7, c5, since your king is already in safety and you have already developed, well, also a number of pieces. So I think in this position I would have preferred to play c5, and then after d takes c5, knight bd7 to try and recapture on c5 with the knight, and then after knight c3, knight takes c5, we would have had quite a normal position. But back to the game, where after h6 and the exchange on f6, white was given the opportunity to play another rare move, which had only really been played before, as far as top players is concerned, by Yakovenko against Bakro in 2015. Mamedyarov now opted for h2, h4. Okay, again, it's really a rather rare move, and I cannot help but feel that these moves, although they may put the opponent under a certain psychological pressure, should not really work out in a serious over-the-board game. Again, I feel that the principled approach here is to play c5, trying to open up the position to react against an attack on the flank with an attack in the center. Because let's remember, h2, h4, it doesn't put a pawn in the center for white, which he had already done with d4 and e3. So in that regard, it doesn't really help white's opening. It also didn't develop any of the minor pieces, and therefore it also didn't bring closer the safety of white's king, being that on the king side or on the queen side. I think the only aspect of h2, h4 that makes sense is that it tries to clamp down on the light squares, and we can already foresee that white is probably going to pursue a light squared strategy, since he exchanged earlier his bishop of the light squares, which can never control light squares. His bishop of the dark squares, of course, which can never control light squares, for black's knight that was on f6, which can control light squares, and in fact was already doing so 8 times from f6. So I feel that that is the only, let's say for the moment, strategically positive aspect of h2, h4. To try and clamp down on these light squares, right? Another idea, of course, is to play g2, g4, and then attack with g4, g5. But again, the only idea that white is pursuing there is to hopefully open up the h file so that he can deliver a checkmate on a light square. Exactly. So, yeah. Interesting move, of course, and very typical Mamedyarov, right, to push one of those rook pawns forward. Well, as mentioned, I felt c5 would be a principled approach, when after g4 black can try and crash through in the center with c takes d4. Some sort of counterattack on the dark squares where he is still, where he is of course stronger, right, having still the dark squared bishop. Play could then continue with g5, but now an interesting piece sacrifice, completely ripping open white's center and also all the pawn shield protection in front of white's king. It is a piece sacrifice. G takes f6, queen f6, which hits the knight, by the way, and only now after bishop g2 defending the knight on f3, e takes f2, and after queen takes f2, knight c6. I think the position is completely unclear, and I'm not so sure that Mamedyarov would have liked to be on the white side of this position. I think that he wants to be the one attacking and putting his opponent under pressure, and that he would prefer his opponents to have the less safe king position. Okay, I think here a very interesting battle would be ahead. Back to the game, where instead of c5 after h4, black opted for g6. Now we can understand this move, because if white now continues with h5, then he can lock up the king side with g5, right? And if white were to continue after g6 with g4, then black can retreat the bishop and go h5 after g5, again locking up the king side. But g6 is also a reactive move, and in that sense it sort of justifies h2, h4. Now it is very difficult, in a first round game where everybody is sort of nervous, and when you see your opponent play h2, h4, trying to mess with your mind, to come up with c7, c5, think of the piece sacrifice and already have the courage after 8th move, when you're still trying to acclimatize to the tension in the tournament, to play in such an active way. Anyway, in itself there's nothing wrong with g6, but as I say, it sort of fits in better with white's strategy than c7, c5, I feel. Well, still, h5 would not have been a bad try, because it is consequent in the sense that it tries to undermine and attack the light squares. And even though black will be able to close up the king side for now, later on in the game he may still suffer from these light squared weaknesses, right? So it would have been logical, I feel, for Mamedyarov to play h5 and only then after g5 go knight c3 as he played in the game. So instead of that, knight c3 was played immediately, and now black could have considered h5 himself, right? So maintaining control of as many light squares as possible. Now You may say, but that weakens the g5 square, right? And if the knight jumps into g5, then again it is controlling so many light squares. Yes, this is true, but at least we would not be opening up again the king's side and get some more light square control with our pawn. And let's not forget, the g5 square for the moment isn't even accessible for the knight, because black is controlling that square twice, with both his queen and his bishop. So h5 would have been quite a solid and safe way to play, and that is why I feel that it was probably better for white after g6 to first play h5 and then only after g5 play knight c3. Anyways, after knight c3, black did not play h5, but instead now he opted for c5. But I feel that maybe now it's not really the right time to do it. In comparison to the earlier positions, white has already developed his knight, which is putting pressure on the d5 pawn together with the c4 pawn, and white is also able to develop his rook to the d file very quickly, again putting more pressure on the d5 pawn. And let's note that this is also a light square strategy, right? So it would be perfectly logical for white to also put pressure not only on the king side light squares but also on the central light squares. For that reason, I think it would have been better to play h5 or play maybe a bit more conservatively with knight c6, hoping to open up the position later with a move like e6, e5, also allowing his a temporarily bad bishop to develop to a square like g4, for instance. But back to the game where c5 was played, and now quite logically, even though we're told not to take away from the center or to release tension, white simply took a pawn. And why not, right? That pawn is not protected in the moment. It means that he's up a pawn right now, and it opens up the semi-open d file for the rook, and this allows white to put pressure on the d5 pawn. Now black continues to play on the light squares, which really is the domain of white. He now played d takes c4, and again I feel that it is somehow not a very positive decision, and that black is drifting a little bit in this opening, and that he will suffer the consequences later on in the middle game and even deep into the end game, even though that end game was tenable at a certain moment, but we will see later. Instead of d takes c4, to my eye it would have made more sense to play a move like knight a6 to try and recapture that pawn and play on the dark squares, right? But d takes c4, well, it does lose a tempo. It opens up the d file, which is probably preferable for white at the moment, since he can gain a tempo against the queen. But also it allows white's bishop to come to c4, which again is a light square, from where it will exert beautiful pressure again on, of course, those light squares here on the king side. But before recapturing on c4, now Mamedyarov is realizing that he should probably flick in h4, h5 before it's too late, and black plays h5 himself. So now he plays h5, and of course Wesley reacts with g5, and only now he takes on c4. And I feel that after these 12 moves that white has gained some sort of opening advantage. He's up a pawn, his development is better, his king will be safer than black's, and he does have some sort of an interesting clamp on the light squares. Especially this quadrant, you know, it somehow doesn't feel very good for black. And let's also not forget that the entire black queen side is not developed yet. So in this particular moment, even though black has the bishop pair, to compensate a little bit, I would give white an opening advantage. Well, Wesley plays here queen a5 with the idea either to recapture the lost pawn or maybe inflict doubled pawns for white here on the c-file. But Mamedyarov does not allow the infliction of the double pawns. He overprotects the knight on c3, and he says, well, you can have that pawn. That one was probably lost anyway. And for me, it's just about the light square control and the better development, and so on, and so on, and so on. Again, I have a feeling that Wesley here makes an inaccurate move. He played knight d7. Somehow maybe not being sure as to how to recapture on c5 with the queen or with the knight. But the thing is that it blocks in the bishop, right? And the knight is not ideally placed over there. Probably it would have been better to develop it maybe to c6. But the other reason why I don't really like it is white now has an opportunity to castle, bring his king into safety and away from a dark square. Whereas if white instead of knight d7, black instead of knight d7 would have recaptured the pawn now on c5 with the queen, he would be hitting the bishop, prompting white to defend that, and making use of the fact that the defense knight e4 can still be answered with queen b4 check, hitting this pawn twice. And well, that's sort of unclear, you know, if you can really win that pawn as some sort of compensation for white's initiative. So I feel that he should have made use of his opportunity to regain the pawn right here, right now, with queen takes c5. Because after knight d7, as mentioned, white castled, and now if he were to recapture with the queen, for instance, then knight e4 would be a good move, because there is no queen b4 check anymore, and white would also be taking away black's dark squared bishop, if nothing else. And here knight c5 is not a very happy move, because both of black's pieces are now in a pin, and even though the threat may still be bishop c3 to get out of that fork, white could first flick in knight d4 to shield against the bishop, and then prepare a3 b4, really gaining space on the queen side and asking those pieces, what on earth are you doing there? Aren't you just sitting there on those squares being vulnerable? Okay, so castles was played in the game by Mamedyarov, and now instead of regaining the pawn immediately, Wesley decided to also just give up his dark square bishop. But let's not forget, this was basically his best piece and also the better half of the bishop pair, and now he simply relinquishes that as any form of compensation that he might have. Queen c3 followed, queen c3, rook c3, and only now knight takes c5. But now we have a queenless middle game where again white still is enjoying light square control and much the better development. Basically all of his pieces are developed, whereas only black's knight has been brought out into the game, and it's even unprotected. Fortunately for him, bishop e6 doesn't work, of course, because the knight can recapture on e6, so that would not be good for white to play, of course. But white did something else. He simply centralized his knight, right? Knight e5. Look at that. In order to pressure the opponent on his half of the board for a knight, the knight needs to jump ahead, right? Otherwise his legs are too short and he cannot control any significant squares on the opponent's half of the board. And let's see, what is he doing? Well, he is controlling a lot of light squares, right? And in combination with this beautiful bishop and possibly later the rooks, this piece is exerting very serious pressure on black's position. And Wesley said something about this, that he underestimated the strength of this knight when he was being interviewed after the game. Okay, so now how how does black continue? Well, if he tries to evict the knight, try to exchange that beautiful knight on e5 for his rather, well, useless knight, you could say, then of course white would not oblige and play knight g4, hitting the pawn on h6. And then after king g7 and the retreat bishop b3, we see that white is already threatening to bring a rook to the 7th rank, and still all of black's pieces are clogged up, right? Now you might say, but wait, f5, doesn't that completely push back white's knight? Yes, but there is always the counter defense, or let's say the counter attack as most important type of the defense against an attack. Here we see bishop e6, and now when black thinks, but that just sacrifices a piece, here comes rook c7, hitting the knight on d7 for the second time, and it turns out that after rook d8, the second defense, rook d1 is the third attack on the knight, and here white is just simply immediately winning the game. Look at that pin. It's a double pin, right, across the rook, but also against the king. Horrible position for black to be in. So the idea of knight d7 after knight e5 is not really a very happy one. So Wesley decided just to try and develop his bishop. b7, b6, right? It is high time that he does something. But here Mamedyarov plays a very typical move, and he makes black feel that he's really already a little bit too late for comfort to defend this position. Now rook d1 was a very good option, and Yasser Seren's choice, no doubt, very solid advantage. For instance, after bishop b7, which connects the rook and sort of threatens to bring a rook to the d file to neutralize white's play, you could continue, for instance, rook a3, very interesting. And now if any rook goes to the d file, you exchange on d8 and you take the pawn on a7, right? And already your strategic play bears fruit. So that would not be possible. But if that's not possible, then probably white's move, amongst other tries, is going to be b4, kicking away the knight on c5, which in turn is a defender of d7. So then a white rook could penetrate on d7 on the 7th rank, hitting targets, here on f7 and here on b7, and who knows, even in conjunction with the rook on a3, also a7. So rook d1 would have led to a very solid advantage, but maybe too normal a type of advantage and not really to Mamedyarov's liking. Instead, he plays f2, f4, giving his opponent even more to think about. Typical Mamedyarov. He says, well, there are two ways to activate the rook. Either you bring the rook to an open file, or you open up the file where the rook already is. So one of his ideas is now to either exchange here or push the f-pawn, so that in the near future this rook will pressure all these pieces down the f-file. Very logical idea. Well, still it feels that that black is only able to play here with his knight. I'm thinking now, why didn't he move his bishop? For instance, let's say I didn't analyze this move. Why was it not possible to play this move? I'm not really sure at the moment why this was not possible. One idea that springs to mind is that he would play b2, b4, but here after knight e4 and rook d3, maybe indeed you would be able to play a rook to d8, so that would defend after bishop b7. So I think the idea must have been to play something else. One idea that springs to mind is that you still can open up the f-file with f5 as was played in the game, or that you can maybe take here now, right, when you're sort of forced to recapture like that. But now the f-file is open, and a move like knight g4 is very strong. So I think that along those lines Mamedyarov would have tried to pursue his initiative. Anyways, after f4, knight e4 was played, and this knight is really making a lot of moves. But we can understand that black wants to recapture on g5 if there is an exchange with his knight, because then he would in turn be overprotecting these light squared weaknesses. Well, the rook is attacked right now, so rook d3 was played. But now there's this funny fork, knight g3, but again, black is only playing with the knight. So rook f3 was played, and now Wesley decided to go back to e4 with his knight, and this whole knight journey was criticized. But let's not forget that taking on h5 instead of going back to e4 is maybe even more dangerous, because there would follow rook h3, and now after knight f6 rook takes h6, and then after king g7, f takes g5, knight e4, rook h5 protecting the pawn is possible. And if black now tries to finish development with bishop b7, there is again this nasty rook d7 posting up on the 7th rank. And if you try to evict the rook, then white doesn't switch back to the 3rd rank from whence he came, but of course to the 4th rank. And I'm really not happy when I would be playing black here, because all of white's pieces are aimed, or will be aimed anytime soon, against his king. So very unpleasant position to play here for black. So back to the game, where after knight e4 the knight was chased with rook d4, and it feels that the knight now must remain in place. So black decided to protect the knight with bishop b7, because let's see what happens if the knight again makes a move. Then there would be an exchange on g5, and now even this type of sacrifice would be possible, because black can't really take that one, because there is now again, or all of a sudden rather, a weakness on the back rank. And it turns out that the black king cannot keep in touch with his rook on f7, which it needs to do because it's defending the rook on f7, right? So after king g7 there would follow h6, and now after king g6 there is an exchange, but now the king cannot stay in touch with the h-pawn, and on the next move white will simply promote to a queen on the h8 square and be simply winning the game. So therefore after rook d4 bishop b7 was played, and now not f takes g5 because a knight takes g5 is quite nice, you know, multifunctional, hitting the rook but also protecting those light squared weaknesses. Now instead, of course, Mamedyarov now opted for f5, trying to pry open still the f file, but also the Italian diagonal. And this is exactly, let's say, the burning point where all of white's pieces are coming together. Well, knight f6 was played to try and shield the h file, but also hitting this pawn here, but probably most importantly trying to prepare bishop d5 so that this bishop can also start defending on the light squares. Yeah, and of course the knight discovers an attack from the bishop here on the rook. Now at first thought you may think, well, let's just sacrifice the exchange, right? Isn't there already enough energy in white's position? So let's see what happens. F takes e6, but then of course black would take the rook, g takes, f takes, bishop e6 check, king h7. Note that the king should go to the 7th rank because king h8 runs into knight g6 check. But now rook c4 threatening to go to the 7th rank, and after knight takes h5, rook c7 looks like a deadly check, but there is still knight g7 as a possibility. Note that king h8 would lead to knight g6 checkmate, so knight g7 keeps everything together, the only move to defend. And it turns out that now after bishop d5, threatening a check on e4, and rook ac8, confronting that very strong rook, there is nothing more in the position for white than a perpetual with bishop e4 check, bishop d5 check, etc. So Mamedyarov doesn't play like that. And why give up the tension, right? If there's not enough interest made on your money to get it off the bank. He just simply retreats the rook and he says, well, you're still left with the same problems. So now rook a to e8 was played, overprotecting the pawn on e6. Of course, the pawn cannot save itself, because exchanging on f5 would just simply invite the rook to come back, and now the knight would be attacked, and behind it still the f7 pawn, so that would be really bad for black. But rather rook a to e8, which is bringing just another piece into defense, which is of course the most healthy thing you can do. But now white really tries to sort of trade down his initiative, his pressure, into some sort of an advantageous endgame. He plays f takes e6, there followed f takes e6, and now it was possible for white to sacrifice the exchange, but not on f3 but rather on f6, and this leads to really different circumstances, because after rook takes f6, rook d7 would be possible, and now really the only decent move is rook c8. But after rook a7, white still has a very dominating position, clearly superior pieces, and he would still enjoy a certain advantage. But I can imagine that it was a bit scary also for Mamedyarov to sacrifice the exchange here. It's not like that there are also queens on the board when you would maybe play such a sacrifice more easily. Instead, after the exchange of pawns on e6, he toyed around a little bit with black, also probably gaining some time on the clock and getting closer to the 40th move, with knight g6, rook f7, knight e5, and rook back to f8. And now he decided to put up the pressure, or step up the pressure rather, with rook d6, which again attacks the e6 move another time. But that of course allowed black to bring in this defender. And only now, under these particular circumstances, did white to decide to play an exchange sacrifice. But it's really a sham sacrifice, because it leads to a favorable rook endgame. The question, however, is, will it be enough to win it? Rook takes f6, rook takes f6, and now it turns out that the rook is unprotected and that the pawn on e6 is pinned against that rook. So now he takes on d5. Of course, black was forced to recapture. Fortunately for him, now also the knight is hanging on e5. But after rook takes rook and rook takes knight, white is the first one to start snapping off some pawns, right? But black keeps up with him. It's still 4 against 4. But here goes the second pawn. Rook g6, king h7, rook takes g5. But hey, isn't black just keeping up the pace here with rook e2? Doesn't he have just sufficient counterplay for this type of rook endgame to hold the draw? And by the way, aren't all rook endgames draws? Yes, this may be the case. And I think that, as a matter of fact, the rook endgame is a draw. So unfortunately for Mamedyarov, this type of trade down into this particular rook endgame, where still it seems that he has the better chances, did not lead to sufficient advantage to really win the game. So here comes king h2. In the endgame, you're supposed to activate your king, and of course he doesn't want to put or to push his g-pawn while his king would be still cut off on the second rank, so they followed king h2. But after rook takes a2, it's really 2 against 2, right? But there is maybe a slight difference. White's pawns have advanced ever so slightly more than black's pawns. Also, white's rook is a bit better than black's rook, because this guy can start checking from the side, and this guy is really a little bit in front of his own pawns, even though this pawn could march on unhindered. But it's really about a race, and white is a little bit ahead in the race, and also because his king may be able to support those two connected passed pawns. So that's why white has the better chances in this particular rook endgame. Well, king h3 was played, so the g2 pawn was pinned, so in order to push it, he first has to unpin the pawn. But now Wesley really makes the final mistake in this game. Maybe so far his mistakes were not so serious, in the sense that if this rook endgame was in the end everything that Mamedyarov could get, then maybe it were just all inaccuracies, really. But this one really loses the game after a7, a5. I think it was absolutely necessary, while there was still time, to start defending against white's pawns with king h6. Let's see what happens. If now white tries to pursue his advantage with g4, there follows rook a1, and this prepares to start checking the white king from the first rank, so that this king will never be able to perform good supporting duties. Now there are two ways to try and continue. Let's first take a look at king h4, which prepares g5, right? Then there would follow check, and after king g3 again check, and after king f3 again check. And now if you want to walk away towards the rook and say, rook, get out of my face, king g2, well, then the rook would go back. But then of course you still would not be preparing the push g5, because black's king would take on h5. Then you could say, well, I have another trump, let's continue with rook d6 check, and then after king d5, rook g6 check. But then black's king sneaks in, and there is some sort of a role reversal, and now this king and this rook will be harassing this white king very seriously, and white will not have time and coordination enough to promote any of those pawns, because he will be busy defending against black's king and rook. So that's a problem. And then after king h6, which was the only drawing move really, and g4 and rook a1, let's try the other attacking idea. So let's not start with king h4, but rather the immediate rook d6. But again, we block on the dark squares, and rook g6, king f4 again is good enough to hold the draw. The king is centralized and is making white's king life hard difficult. Okay, that was a very strange English sentence, my apologies for not being a native speaker there. You could still say, okay, h6 then? Yeah, but rook h1 check. King g2 then? Yeah, but rook h4. G5 then? Yeah, but king f5. Rook g8 then? Yeah, but a5. Okay, but king g3 then? Yeah, but rook h5. And it becomes clear that black now clearly has sufficient counterplay with his queenside pawns, but also sufficient defense at the same time against white's pawns, right? So that's very important. So instead of a5, which was played after king h3, he should have gone king h6. The thing with a5 is that it doesn't set up this type of blockade, or this defensive combination of king and rook against white's king and the kingside pawns in time. And of course it uses the own queenside pawns, but these queenside pawns will not promote in time. So in this case the counterattack is not sufficiently constraining white's chances, because white is always going to be the faster one. Well, you could say after g4, but let's go king h6 here then, right? But there is already a very important difference, and we can show it to you by playing through one of the earlier lines. King h4, rook h2, king g3, rook c2, and now after rook d6 check, king g5, rook g6 is checkmate. In the earlier line we saw that the king could escape to f4, but here that's simply not possible. So here after the check, black would be forced to go back. And then, of course, if black goes here or here, then white's king can come up and these pawns can advance much, much more easily. So that's why it's already winning, and that's why it's too late to play the idea of king h6 here again. Well, a4 was played, that also didn't really help, but as mentioned, it's too late. Maybe more tenacious was to play rook a1 to still try and keep harassing the white king from behind and make white show more technique, because there's so many ways to go wrong in a rook endgame. It's incredible. I mean, we see Wesley So, a 2800 player, to go wrong here, you know, with his a5 move. I mean, king h6 is really the only drawing move. But the thing is, with these rook endgames, you need to calculate so deeply, because to figure out what's going on, really, sometimes you just have to calculate 10 moves ahead. As in this line, king h6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, you know, before maybe you get this feeling of what's actually going on. So yeah, that's why endgame play in general is so difficult. Okay, enough about that. g4, a4 was played, but now g5. You know, look at those two pawns. They're very nicely abreast here, and they're already threatening to push the king to the back rank. And note that still there is not a harassing check available for black's rook. Well, a3 was played, rook d7, pushing the king back, rook d8, winning some time on the clock, and only now making use of another tempo, g6. King h6 was played, and now Mamedyarov played a very automatic and human move, which does win. Somehow you don't want to give away your h5 pawn, and therefore he played rook h8, which checks and protects the h5 pawn, and allows him, after king g7, to continue with rook h7. But instead of rook h8 check, there was the very simple and sort of immediately winning rook d7 exclamation mark, because black can never take that pawn because the g pawn runs, right? It can also not be stopped by the rook, because the only defensive square for the rook is taken by white's king. So that would be an immediate win. Rook d7. Black cannot take the h pawn, and if he does not, well, then the next move simply is going to be g7, g8, and it's over. Okay, well, back to the game, where Mamedyarov made life a little bit more difficult for himself by playing rook h8, because after king g5, rook h7 check, king g8, it would have been possible for him to go seriously wrong. Now this pawn is still protecting this pawn, and the king can come up to protect this pawn. So the mistake to make here would have been to play h6, when this guy would have been unprotected, and after a subsequent king g4, this pawn would also not be protected. Now rook a1 all of a sudden would draw for black, because after rook b7 threatening mate, there would be the check, and after king g2 there would be the all-important gain of the pawn. Rook takes h6. Okay, well, Mamedyarov is a little bit too strong to make that kind of mistake, so he starts with moving his rook over the 7th rank, puts it where it belongs, behind the enemy, passed pawn on a7, and now after rook a1, king g2, sidestepping all the checks, rook c1 and h6 was played after all. Note that instead of rook c1, a2, then h6 would also be winning. Okay, back to the game. King g2, rook c1 was played, h6. Now, okay, Wesley played a little bit obliging here with rook c8, immediately defending his back rank. Maybe it would have been a good idea to try and test Mamedyarov's technique a little bit more with rook c2 check, and then of course the king walks towards the rook. Because then at a certain moment the rook can no longer deliver the checks, and then you're still faced with this checkmating threat, etc, etc. But here, after rook c3, king e4, rook c4 check, Mamedyarov still would have had to play a rather nice move, namely king e3, so that after rook c3 and king d4 he is hitting the rook when the rook is on an unprotected square. Otherwise he would be hitting the rook here, and there, funnily enough, the rook would be protected. So this would be a little bit more precise. And only now rook c8 h7 and king h8, e5, a2, king f6 would be leading to the win. Because note that here, when black promotes, of course you have to take that after this check, white has an escape square for his king on h6. And now there is a double threat. There is the threat of rook a8 with checkmate, or the threat of g7 with checkmate. So the game could end rook c8, g7, checkmate. Instead, as mentioned, black immediately defended the back rank, and now it was just a matter of mopping up, even though white needed to remain very precise until the end. So here goes black's first passed pawn, b5, here comes the other, but white quickly goes back to the 7th rank, the dominating position. And now after b4 he would even go behind that pawn as well. So Wesley instead tried rook b8. Let's see what happens. He is still defending against this mate. He is still trying to promote his own pawn, and for the moment the king can just step aside if the h-pawn is going to give him a check, right? So we need the king to come up and support in delivering the final blow. And here king g3 was very nicely calculated, because it turns out, speaking of making your task harder, that white is just in time. And here black resigned, so Wesley showed that he could also calculate. But let's see exactly why he resigned. There followed b4, or there could have followed b4, I should say. King g4, b3, and now not king g5. It's still not too late to go wrong. Rook b5 and white's king will not find shelter, or the black pawn promotes, but first h7 check, so that again after king h8, king g5, rook b5 check, the king has an escape square on h6. And again, black would be faced here with the double threat of rook a8 or g7 mate, and he would have to resign. So then instead of checking on b5, he could still try b2, but then it turns out, as mentioned, that white is just in time with king h6. And now after the promotion, yes, g7 is checkmate. My god. Okay, beautiful. Well, that puts Mamedyarov in first place, together with Aronian, by the way, who won a very nice Berlin endgame with the white pieces against Sergei Karyakin. And what I find very noteworthy about Levon Aronian at the moment is that he started playing e4 almost unrelentlessly. And at a certain moment in time, when e4 has never been his main move, he was even up 36 minutes on the clock in a Berlin endgame against Berlin endgame expert Sergei Karyakin. So I don't know what's going wrong or what's going on, but Aronian must have been doing a lot of homework there, you know. And the commentators also think that, well, in order to be more successful, he needs to find new resources. He has to mix it up, change his game. So maybe we will see Mamedyarov playing one e2, e4 on many, many more occasions, which would be fun. Absolutely. Okay, well, with that, we've come to the end of this video. Let me remind you that this is the 100th video that I've created for the Better Your Chess channel, and that is cause for celebration. So I've decided to give a 33% discount on the perpetual Better Your Chess membership. If you want to make use of that offer, which is valid for the coming 5 days, so please make sure to be in time, then take a look at the link in the video description. That link will bring you to the page where you can sign up and get the membership. Okay, well, thank you for listening and watching to this video, and suppose I'll see you in a next one. Bye bye.